The studio lights blazed down on the polished stage of the LTV Evening Show, casting sharp shadows that seemed to dance nervously with the tension in the air. The host, a man with slicked-back hair and a perpetually smug grin, leaned forward in his chair, his voice oozing with a syrupy, manufactured concern that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Did you ever DNA test Barron Trump?" He read aloud from a viewer-submitted question, his tone dripping with insinuation. The words slithered out, each syllable deliberately stretched, as if he was savoring the chaos he hoped to unleash. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the rustle of fabric and muted coughs punctuating the sudden stillness. For a heartbeat, no one moved. No one dared breathe too loudly. Then the host's lips curled into a smile, a calculated, predatory thing that gleamed under the lights, and the atmosphere in the room shifted like a storm cloud rolling in. "You see?" he continued, his voice now a conspiratorial whisper, drawing the audience into his web. This question was handpicked from thousands of submissions. He paused for dramatic effect, glancing down at the card in his manicured hand, as if it held some dark secret. The camera, ever obedient to the director's silent cue, zoomed in on Melania Trump's face, hunting for any flicker of unease, any crack in her poised exterior. Her expression remained a mask of serene elegance, cheekbones sharp as glass, eyes steady as steel. But the lens couldn't capture the subtle tightening of her jaw, the quiet storm brewing beneath her calm. The host, oblivious to her restraint, pressed on, his implication as clear as the venom in his smirk. "When someone asks about DNA testing the son of a former president, we have to wonder about their true motives." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic, their meaning unmistakable. The studio lights seemed to dim, or perhaps it was just the oppressive weight of what he was attempting to do, a cheap shot dressed up as journalism. But he'd made a critical misstep, one he wouldn't realize until it was far too late. Melania's gaze didn't waver, but something in her eyes shifted, a spark of recognition that cut through the host's theatrics. She wasn't looking at him anymore. Her focus had drifted past the blinding lights, past the sea of faces, to a woman in the back row, whose presence the cameras hadn't yet noticed. That woman, Mrs. Anderson, though no one knew her name yet, sat rigid, her knuckles bone-white as she gripped her purse with a desperation that bordered on pain. Her other hand clutched a battered manila folder, its edges frayed from months of anxious handling, stuffed to bursting with what looked like medical documents, pages of diagnoses, bills, and unanswered pleas. Her dark hair was pulled back in a hasty bun, strands escaping to frame a face etched with exhaustion. She kept opening her mouth as if to speak, then clamping it shut again, her lips trembling with the weight of words she couldn't yet release. Her eyes, wide and glassy with unshed tears, darted between Melania and the host, panic rising in her chest like floodwaters. She wasn't here for gossip or scandal. She was here because something in that question had ripped open a wound she'd been carrying alone for years. The host, still basking in his own cleverness, leaned back in his chair. "Let's dig into this, shall we?" he said, his voice now laced with a mock innocence that fooled no one. "A question like that. It's not just curiosity, is it?" He gestured theatrically to the audience, inviting them to join his game. But before he could spin his web tighter, Melania's voice cut through the haze, smooth and steady as a blade. "I'd like to speak directly to the person who asked this question," she said, rising from her seat with a grace that silenced the room. The host's smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Oh, I don't think we need to," he began, scrambling to regain control, But Melania was already standing, her posture radiating a quiet authority that made his bluster seem small. The studio fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Melania's heels clicked softly against the stage as she stepped forward, her tailored white dress catching the light like a beacon. "Because I know why she really asked about genetic testing," she said, her words carrying a weight that stopped the host cold. All eyes turned to the back row, where Mrs. Anderson rose unsteadily to her feet, her hands trembling so violently that the folder slipped from her grasp. Papers spilled across the floor. Medical bills, test results, letters from specialists, scattering like leaves in a storm. Tears streamed down her face, carving paths through the faint makeup she'd worn to look presentable. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her voice raw and breaking. "I didn't mean it like that at all." The host's face drained of color, his carefully crafted narrative unraveling before his eyes. Mrs. Anderson's knees buckled slightly as she steadied herself against her chair. "My son, Tommy, he's 14 and already 6'4", she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "He's growing so fast, and the doctors want all these expensive genetic tests." She gestured helplessly at the papers now littering the floor, a paper trail of her family's descent into financial ruin. "I've been working 3 jobs, waitressing, cleaning offices, even delivering papers at dawn. We sold the car last year, and the medical bills." Her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. "They just keep coming. Tommy's in pain all the time. His joints ache, his back hurts, and the specialists keep ordering more tests, but we can't afford them." The audience leaned forward, drawn into her story, the rawness of her desperation piercing through the host's artificial drama. Mrs. Anderson was no longer just a silhouette in the back row. She was a mother fighting a losing battle, her once bright eyes dulled by sleepless nights and endless worry. She'd submitted her question to the show not to stir scandal, but as a last, desperate cry for help, a plea thrown into the void, hoping someone, anyone, might hear. The host, sensing the shift in the room, tried to claw back his moment. "Let's get back to the question of DNA testing," he interjected, his voice sharp with forced cheer. But Melania silenced him with a single raised hand, her gaze locked on Mrs. Anderson. "You saw how tall Barron has grown," she said softly, her Slovenian accent lending her words a gentle cadence. "And you wondered if we had faced the same medical concerns you're facing now." She reached for a sleek black folder on the table beside her, a stark contrast to Mrs. Anderson's tattered one, and opened it with a deliberate calm that made the host shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Mrs. Anderson," Melania said, holding up a document that bore the unmistakable logo of a prestigious medical institute. "We've been expecting you." The audience gasped, but not for the reason the host had intended. His planned exposé was crumbling, brick by brick, and he hadn't even seen the full scope of his miscalculation yet. "3 months ago, when your question was first submitted," Melania continued, her voice steady but warm, "we did something different than what some people hoped we'd do." Her eyes flicked briefly to the host, who squirmed under her gaze, his tie suddenly too tight around his neck. "Instead of dismissing it or using it for political theater, we investigated, not to expose anyone, but to understand why a mother would ask such a question on national television." She held up the thick file, its pages neatly tabbed and annotated. "Your son's medical bills total $147,800, she said, her tone softening as Mrs. Anderson's breath hitched audibly. "You've been to 17 specialists across 3 states. You've sold your car taken extra jobs, even tried crowdfunding, all because Tommy's growing 4 inches every 6 months, and no one can tell you why. The details were precise, almost intimate, proof that Melania had done more than just skim a report. She'd listened. She'd cared. Mrs. Anderson sank back into her seat, her hands pressed to her face as tears spilled over. The weight of being seen, truly seen, overwhelming her. The host tried one last time to steer the narrative back to his scandal. "But about the DNA testing," he began, his voice cracking slightly under the strain. Melania turned to him, her eyes flashing with a quiet fury that made him shrink back. "Yes, let's talk about DNA testing," she said, her words cutting through his bluster like a knife. "Let's talk about how the Trump family knows exactly why Barron is so tall. His father is 6'3". I was a model. It's a simple genetic blessing, and now we're going to use it to help others." The studio screens flared to life, and Barron Trump's face appeared, his tall frame filling the frame with an easy confidence. His dark hair was neatly combed, his eyes bright with a warmth that belied his imposing height. "Hey, Tommy," he said, his voice steady and kind. "I heard you're part of the Tall Kids Club, too." A ripple of laughter spread through the audience, a release of tension that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Mrs. Anderson's head snapped up, her tear-streaked face breaking into a fragile, hopeful smile. The host's face twisted into a grimace, his carefully rehearsed mask slipping as Barron's voice echoed through the studio. He'd spent weeks plotting this moment, imagining the headlines, "Paternity Scandal Rocks Trump Family," and the smug satisfaction of watching his ratings soar. Now, that vision was dissolving like smoke, replaced by something he couldn't control, a genuine connection unfolding live on air. He leaned forward, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest of his chair, and tried to claw back the narrative. "What an incredibly sweet and compassionate young man," he said, his voice thick with forced admiration, the words dripping with a calculated edge. "It's almost hard to believe he's Donald Trump's son, isn't it?" The studio temperature seemed to plummet, the air growing heavy with the weight of his insinuation. His attempt to revive the paternity question was blatant, wrapped in a flimsy veil of humor that fooled no one. Mrs. Anderson's hopeful smile faltered, her eyes widening in horror as she realized how her desperate plea was being twisted again. She clutched Tommy's latest medical report, a crumpled page detailing his latest growth spurt and the accompanying pain. Her fingers trembling, as if the paper itself might betray her further. The other audience members shifted in their seats, some exchanging uneasy glances, others glaring at the host with a mix of disgust and recognition. They saw the manipulation for what it was, a cruel game played at the expense of a struggling family. Emboldened by his own audacity, the host pressed on, his smirk widening as he turned to the audience. "I mean, look at this touching moment, such empathy, such kindness." He gestured theatrically at the screen, where Barron's face remained calm and composed, oblivious to the venom being slung his way. "Makes you wonder about nature versus nurture, doesn't it? We all know Donald Trump's reputation, brash, unapologetic, larger than life. Perhaps Barron's gentle nature comes from somewhere else." The implication landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of tension through the room. A few audience members gasped, others murmured in disapproval, but the host leaned back, satisfied, certain he'd reclaimed his moment. He was wrong. Melania's smile didn't waver, but her eyes, those piercing, ice-blue eyes, flashed with something that made the host's confidence flicker. She leaned forward slightly, her posture as regal as a queen addressing a court, and when she spoke, Her voice was crisp and unwavering. "Actually," she said, her accent sharpening each word like a blade, "Barron learned compassion exactly from his father." The host shrank back in his chair, his tie suddenly a noose around his neck. "You see, Donald Trump has been quietly helping families in need for decades, long before he entered politics. The media just doesn't show that side of him, perhaps because it doesn't fit their narrative." Her words carried the weight of lived experience, a quiet testimony to kindnesses the public had never witnessed. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. Her calm certainty was enough to make the host's bluster seem hollow. He tried to laugh it off, fumbling for a retort. "Come now, Mrs. Trump, we've all seen his tweets, his public persona." But Melania wasn't finished. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made him squirm. "It's interesting that you find kindness incompatible with strength," she said. "Donald taught our son that real power lies in helping others when you have the means to do so. If you find that surprising, maybe it's because you're the kind of person he's been fighting against. Those who use others' struggles for political games instead of actually helping them." A smattering of applause broke out in the audience, tentative at first, then growing louder as people nodded in agreement. The host's face reddened, his fingers tightening on the armrest as he tried one last desperate angle. "But surely you must admit the contrast between Barron's behavior and his father's public image." He trailed off, his voice faltering as Barron's voice cut through from the screen, clear and firm. "My father taught me that actions speak louder than media narratives," the teenager said, his tone steady and unshaken. At 18, Barron towered over most adults, his broad shoulders and quiet confidence a stark contrast to the host's shrinking presence. "While you're busy trying to create scandals, he's busy creating solutions." The host's jaw tightened, his face flushing an ugly shade of crimson as he realized he was being outmaneuvered. By a teenager, no less. Mrs. Anderson nodded vigorously, tears spilling down her cheeks as she clutched her son's medical report tighter. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice cracking with emotion as she found her courage. "I've been so desperate for help, trying everything, working myself to the bone. And here you were, already working on it." She looked at Melania, her eyes shining with gratitude and disbelief. "While the media was trying to use my question to hurt your family, you were quietly planning to help mine." The host's smug expression had vanished entirely, replaced by a look of dawning panic. His attempt to resurrect the paternity narrative had backfired spectacularly, exposing not a scandal, but a truth he couldn't twist. The Trump family cared about real people, while he cared only about ratings. From the audience, another voice piped up. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a faded sweater stood, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "They helped my daughter too," she called out, her voice trembling but resolute. "No cameras, no publicity, just help when we needed it most." More voices joined in, a chorus of quiet testimonies rising from the crowd. "They paid for my son's surgery. They sent groceries when we lost everything." Each story was a brick in a wall the host couldn't tear down, a wall built on real acts of kindness, not sound bites. Melania stood gracefully, smoothing the front of her dress as she turned to Mrs. Anderson. "If you're finished trying to use my son for ratings," she said to the host, her voice cool and final, "let's get back to what matters." She faced Mrs. Anderson directly, her expression softening. "The doctors are ready to see Tommy first thing tomorrow morning." Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the host slump in his chair, his shoulders sagging in defeat. Every attempt he'd made to create a scandal had instead revealed the true character of the Trump family and his own. The audience had just witnessed a masterclass in turning politically motivated attacks into opportunities for truth, and the weight of that realization hung in the air as the studio lights began to dim. But the story didn't end there. In the days that followed, what was meant to be a fleeting scandal transformed into something extraordinary. Tommy Anderson, a lanky 14-year-old with a shy smile and a mop of unruly brown hair, underwent his first round of tests at the nation's top medical facility, courtesy of the Trump Foundation. The results revealed a rare but treatable condition tied to his rapid growth, a condition shared by dozens of other children across the country. The foundation didn't stop with Tommy. They expanded their medical network across 3 states, creating the largest private support system for families dealing with similar issues. What had started as the host's attempted gotcha moment sparked a movement of real change, one that rippled far beyond the studio walls. 3 months later, at the first support group meeting, Barron stood beside Tommy, his arms slung casually around the younger boy's shoulders. The meeting hall buzzed with life, parents swapping stories of financial struggles, children laughing as they compared their 2 big sneakers. Mrs. Anderson watched from nearby, her face glowing with a pride she hadn't felt in years. Her son had found not just medical help, but a friend, someone who understood the peculiar challenges of being the tall kid. The host, forced by his network to cover the event as penance for his plummeting ratings, stood off to the side, his eyes fixed on the floor. "You tried to use my height to attack my family," Barron said to him, his voice calm but firm. "Instead, you helped us find all these amazing families." Melania addressed the group, her presence commanding yet warm. "Sometimes," she said, her eyes meeting Mrs. Anderson's, "those who try to hurt us give us the greatest opportunities to do good." The room erupted in applause as more families walked through the doors, drawn by word of mouth and hope. The host's career took its final hit that day. His ratings tanked as viewers saw the difference between those who played politics with people's lives and those who actually helped them live better ones. What began with a single question meant to spark scandal had ignited something far more powerful. A reminder that true leadership isn't about tearing others down, but about lifting them up.